The purpose of this channel is to share my life with having a disability and how others treat me. Bring awareness to the struggles of my disability and what happens with not having supports and accommodations and services affect the behavior and emotional well-being of a person with autism and intellectual disabilities. My channel is not to be bullied, not to be harassed, not to have people harass others, not to fight with others. Simple to show how an unsupported disability makes life hell for me and others who care for me and care about me. That is all. I want to educate you with facts, not opinions, not lies, not misinformation. Fact Tylenol was first prescribed in 1955. That autism was around all long before 1955. The diagnosis is more common today due to doctors not afraid to diagnose people with the disability and from the acceptance of how society sees us as useless and problems and stupid and not worth helping us to be able to do the same things others can do in the community. The disability was labeled as a problem child, bad parenting, laziness, defiance, intellectual disability, or mental illness. When doctors first spotted autism is not from the above issues. They felt it was an intellectual disability or learning disability. In 1940s, a German psychiatrist, Dr. Asperger, discovered that autism symptoms are also with others without intellectual disability or learning disability. That was called Asperger in the 1980s. Since 2013, with the DSM-5, it is now autism spectrum disorder for one reason. Scientists found people was not being diagnosed properly. Doctors was giving Asperger syndrome to those with learning disabilities, and that led to the autism not being properly supported. Also, they would see Asperger as not as a disability at all, causing lack of supports for the person. Asperger was meant to be diagnosed autistic disorder, intellectual disability, or learning disability. Autism was then differently when it clearly stated language or vocabulary ability and intellectual abilities has no relationship with criteria for autism. These are SERI. The DSM-5 also removed intellectual disability of needing IQ less than 70. The DSM-5-TR made further changes to intellectual disability to help people like me be properly diagnosed to get the supports people like me who has a low normal IQ. The DSM-5-TR made changes to how autism support levels are. Since then, new research and studies show autism can be diagnosed level 3 and be verbal with heavily scripted and info-dumping capabilities and lack the social reciprocity like I have issues with. That is a recent change to my diagnosis, as I was diagnosed with level 2 autism and now is being said level 3 that IT is confusing. For someone only stating the facts and not fully understand why my doctors made the diagnosis and care plans and medical orders for me, it makes it harder. This makes some professionals not recognize or accept the diagnosis. That is the challenge to me in my life to support and services. I did not say Tylenol doesn't cause autism. I stated a fact: autism was around before Tylenol was first given. I can say another fact. Long-term human costs of nuclear weapons tests in the Pacific. Photo credit, United States Department of Defense. This analysis summarizes and reflects on the following research. Rough, TA, 2015. The humanitarian impact and implications of nuclear test explosions in the Pacific region. International Review of the Red Cross, 97, 899, 775 to 813. Talking points. The total explosive yield of nuclear weapons detonated in the Marshall Islands was the equivalent of dropping 1.6 Hiroshima-sized bombs every day for the 12 years of U.S. testing, 1946 to 1958. In 2004, the U.S. National Cancer Institute estimated that about half of the cancer cases that would occur as a result of Marshall Islands nuclear testing are still to come. Cancer studies have shown that workers during the British nuclear tests in Australia have a 23% higher cancer rate and are 18% more likely to die of cancer than the general public. French Polynesia, ground zero for France's nuclear weapon testing, has the highest rate of acute myeloid leukemia and thyroid cancer in the world, both radiation-induced types of cancer. Summary. The devastating toll of nuclear weapons was most obviously observed after their use in war. Less observed, but also extremely harmful to human life and the environment have been the decades of testing by nuclear-armed countries. This article provides an overview of the nuclear test programs of 3 counties and their devastating toll on the environment, the workers conducting the tests, and the colonized indigenous communities exposed to the nuclear fallout. Since 1945, more than 2,000 nuclear explosions have occurred around the world. All but 2 explosions, the bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, have been for the purpose of development and testing. These tests caused dangerous nuclear fallout that led to physical and biological damage. In the name of national security, governments were willing to accept harm to their own populations and more so to others. The nations conducting the test displayed colonial attitudes regarding the humans exposed to testing. Compared to the civilized test personnel, the primitive, indigenous people had an acceptable radiation dose that was 15 times the acceptable limit proposed by the International Commission of Radiological Protection. The research examines atmospheric, underground, and underwater nuclear weapons tests by 3 different countries illustrate their high human and environmental costs. British nuclear tests in southern Australia. Between 1952 and 1957, the Australian government allowed British nuclear weapons tests in the Montebello Islands and in Maralinga and Emu Field in southern Australia. The highest post-test radiation doses were recorded in local Aboriginal communities. Residents were often not evacuated or informed of the testing and, in some cases, were allowed to stay in contaminated areas for up to 6 years before monitoring organizations warned them of their risk to radiation exposure. Personnel working on a nuclear test were also at high risk of radiation exposure and often lacked vital protective equipment or occupational safety standards. Workers were routinely exposed to radiation doses 80 times higher than the health standards of 1950. Compared to current safety standards, a single nuclear weapons test exposed workers to 20 times today's acceptable yearly limit. 3 decades after the nuclear testing, a government-funded study found test veterans had 23% higher cancer rates and were 18% more likely to die of cancer than the general public. Unresolved long-term issues are indigenous dispossession, remaining contamination, inadequate cleanup, and lack of compensation for indigenous people and workers exposed to hazardous radiation. It wasn't long after that a black smoke came through. We all got crook, every one of us. We were all vomiting. We had diarrhea, skin rashes, and sore eyes. I had really sore eyes. They were so sore I couldn't open them for 2 or 3 weeks. Some of the older people, they died. They were too weak to survive all the sickness. The closest clinic was 400 miles away. Yami Lester, Yankunet Jadra elder and nuclear test survivor, referring to the black mist radioactive fallout after a nuclear test in South Australia on October 15, 1953. United States nuclear tests in the Pacific Islands. After World War II, the United Nations granted the United States administrative authority over the Marshall Islands, where they ran their atmospheric nuclear weapons test program from 1946 to 1958. The Marshallese were removed by 42,000 U.S. soldiers, and their islands were subjected to 67 atmospheric tests, vaporizing entire islands and creating lasting fallout across their land and seas. The total explosive yield of nuclear weapons tested on the Marshall Islands was the equivalent of dropping 1.6 Hiroshima-sized bombs every day over the 12 years of U.S. nuclear testing. During the 1954 Castle Bravo test of a warhead 1,000 times more powerful than the bomb dropped on Hiroshima, no warning or evacuation orders were given to local inhabitants. As a result of the test, 2 islands and part of a third were vaporized, and radioactive fallout blanketed the surrounding islands. Nearly 3 days after the test, evacuation orders were finally given after most of the residents of Rongelap, Alangini, and Utrecht atolls had received near-lethal doses of radiation. These were the highest doses following any test in the history of nuclear test explosions. Medical assessments of children on Rongelap during the time of the Castle Bravo test showed thyroid radiation exposure was more than 2,000 times above normal levels, and nearly all test subjects developed one or more thyroid diseases, including cancer. My island is contaminated. I have 3 tumors in me, and I'm frightened. I don't know whether I should have children or not, because I don't know if I will have a child that is like a jellyfish baby. All I know is that I must travel the world and share a story of the bombs so that we can stop them before they get you.